formally need an introduction, but certainly deserves one, given his academic, business, and government experience and accomplishments. Mark Esper graduated from the US Military Academy. He earned an MA from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, a PhD from George Washington University. He served in the 101st Airborne Division and retired from the US Army in 2007. He worked as an advisor to Senator Chuck Hagel, a person I knew very well because it was with Senator Chuck Hagel that I first designed the idea of an Asia Security Summit in 2001 and proposed to him that the United States take a leading role in it. And that project ultimately became what is now known as the Shangri-La Dialogue. Mark Esper worked at the Heritage Foundation. He was the vice president of the Raytheon Corporation, secretary of the Army, and in July last year became Secretary of Defense. Now, normally the United States Secretary of Defense makes a major annual statement at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. Unfortunately, the IISS, in consultation with our host country, Singapore, decided that we could not convene the Shangri-La Dialogue this year owing to the global pandemic. And we are working hard already towards the 2021 Fullerton Forum and the 2021 Shangri-La Dialogue. Now, this presentation technically isn't part of the Shangri-La Dialogue process, which is a face-to-face activity of defense diplomacy, but we are extremely grateful that in these circumstances, the Secretary asked us for this virtual platform to lay out this summer the United States vision for the Indo-Pacific region. We have over 500 people in this audience from North America, Latin America, Europe, the Middle East, and from all parts of the Asia Pacific. The Secretary will speak for some 20 minutes, and then we will take questions in groups of 3 or 4. Questions can only be asked by raising the blue hand function in Zoom. I will identify you and ask you to be concise. I would remind you that the remarks of the Secretary, the questions, and the answers will all be on the record, and we look forward to a very stimulating 56 minutes. Mr. Secretary, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to be here with you today. Good morning from the Pentagon. Again, I want to thank Dr. Chipman and the International Institute for Strategic Studies for the opportunity to gather virtually and discuss how the Department of Defense is advancing security and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in light of the coronavirus pandemic. You know, as an Indo-Pacific nation, the United States' commitment to a free and open region is rooted deep in the values, history, and economic ties we share with our allies and our partners, and has only grown deeper in the face of efforts to undermine it, especially recently. In fact, this July marks 1 year since my confirmation hearing, where I pledged that my top priority as Secretary would be implementing the National Defense Strategy in an era of great power competition and focusing the department on our priority theater, the Indo-Pacific. I'm proud to report that we've made great progress in this regard, including the steps we've taken to deliver on the 3 pillars of our Indo-Pacific strategy: preparedness, strengthening partnerships, and promoting a more networked region. First, in the category of preparedness, we are divesting from legacy systems and focusing on modernizing our force and strengthening deterrence, as demonstrated by our largest research and development budget in the department's history. We're not only prioritizing the development and deployment of game-changing technologies, such as hypersonic weapons, 5G, and artificial intelligence, but we are also investing in platforms critical to the Indo-Pacific and transforming the way we fight. For the United States Navy, we're working to design a future fleet that is more survivable, adaptable, sustainable, and larger than we have seen in years. Likewise, the Marine Corps is focused on becoming leaner, faster, more lethal and precise, and more geographically distributed in the Pacific. Meanwhile, the Army is prioritizing long-range precision weapons to stay ahead of our competitors' growing anti-access area denial capabilities with greater speed at greater ranges. And the Air Force continues its focus on enhanced stealth capabilities and the advancement of joint all-domain command and control, a vital initiative that will link any sensor to any shooter in the battlefield in real time. To ensure these assets, systems, and capabilities are integrated throughout our armed forces, we are developing a new joint warfighting concept and ultimately doctrine for the 21st century, and implementing novel concepts to become more nimble, less predictable, and able to rapidly shift to combat operations if needed. For instance, we've stepped up bomber task force missions to deliver a quick reaction, persistent, long-term bomber presence in the Indo-Pacific and around the globe. These deployments provide strategic predictability to our allies while remaining operationally unpredictable to our adversaries. Together, these efforts will prepare our military for future high-intensity conflicts against near-peer rivals that we hope we never need to fight, but must be prepared to defeat. Second, under the rubric of strengthening partnerships, we continue to bolster our growing network of Indo-Pacific allies and partners, a strategic advantage our competitors cannot match. Last fall, we renewed a key agreement with Singapore, extending U.S. forward presence and cooperation in the region for another 15 years. With Indonesia, we continue to partner together on maritime security and provide them with top-of-the-line military platforms. And with the Philippines, we're working closely on a range of issues from counterterrorism to maritime security. Additionally, we are supporting Thailand's military modernization by co-procuring Stryker armored vehicles and also partnering with Malaysia and Brunei to increase their maritime domain awareness. And earlier this year, we conducted the second ever U.S. carrier visit to Vietnam in over 4 decades. While we develop these strategic relationships with emerging regional partners, we continue to build on long-standing commitments in the region. This includes working alongside South Korea to achieve the final, fully verified denuclearization of North Korea and an enduring peace on the Korean Peninsula. It also includes partnering with Japan in the space, cyber, missile defense, and advanced technologies domains, as well as our co-development of defense capabilities, intelligence, cooperation, and close policy alignment with Australia. Moreover, we continue to advance our strong partnership with New Zealand and remain committed to a democratic Taiwan. Further, we continue to cultivate robust relationships with Timor-Leste and Mongolia, as well as Pacific Island countries, including Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and Tonga. This summer, I enjoyed speaking with nearly a dozen of my counterparts from across the region and look forward to maintaining close contact until we can meet again in person. In fact, just yesterday, I spoke with ministers of defense from New Zealand and Korea. Lastly, I want to highlight our increased defense cooperation with India, one of the all-important defense relationships of the 21st century. We conducted our first ever joint military exercise last November, and as we speak today, the USS Nimitz is conducting combined exercises with the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean, demonstrating our shared commitment to stronger naval cooperation in support of a free and open Indo-Pacific. We also continue to grow our defense sales and look forward to a robust 2+2 ministerial dialogue later this year to build on this progress. Third and final, under promoting a more networked region, we are encouraging Indo-Pacific nations to expand their own intra-regional security relationships and networks of like-minded partners. For example, over the past several years, Japan has provided maritime vessels to the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, and Bangladesh, bolstering their maritime security. In June, Australia and India finalized an important logistical support agreement. And last year, South Korea pledged to more than double its development assistance to Association of the Southeast Asian Nations by 2022. To support all 3 pillars of our Indo-Pacific strategy, the administration looks forward to working with the United States Congress to establish a Pacific deterrence initiative that will prioritize our investments, maintain a credible deterrent, and demonstrate an enduring whole-of-government commitment to the region. Our efforts across the Indo-Pacific have prepared us well to respond to the prevailing crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic. The U.S. government has committed more than $325 million in coronavirus relief support for our Indo-Pacific partners, including more than $80 million for ASEAN countries. In addition, the Department of Defense has provided much-needed medical training and supplies, including test kits, ventilators, and personal protective equipment. For example, we delivered over 1,000 cots to the Philippines to increase its hospital bed capacity, and our Armed Forces Research Institute of Medical Services is providing technical assistance to several Indo-Pacific countries. Our partners are responding in kind. South Korea supplied the United States with 2.5 million masks, while Malaysia helped send us over 1 million gloves. And factories in Vietnam supplied us with nearly 5 million items of PPE, demonstrating the reciprocal nature of our defense relationships. The devastating worldwide impact of the coronavirus outbreak reinforces the necessity of a rules-based international order rooted in transparency, openness, honesty, and other shared values. In this era of globalization, the antidote to a viral contagion is communication and collaboration, not disinformation and deception. For this reason, I am concerned that while the United States and our partners focus on supporting one another in these challenging times, the Chinese Communist Party continues to engage in systematic rule breaking, coercion, and other malign activities. And most concerning to me, the People's Liberation Army continues its aggressive behavior in the East and South China Seas, including sinking a Vietnamese fishing boat, harassing Malaysian oil and gas development, escorting Chinese fishing fleets into Indonesia's claimed exclusive economic zone, and militarizing occupied features in direct contravention of China's commitments under international law. In doing so, the CCP has bullied ASEAN nations out of an estimated $2.6 trillion in potential offshore oil and gas revenue, not to mention access to fishing grounds that millions of people depend on for their livelihoods. The PLA has also increased the number and duration of its incursions into the waters surrounding the Japanese-administered Senkaku Islands, and the PRC continues to look the other way as North Korea violates UN Security Council resolutions, thereby shielding Pyongyang from the international consequences of its pursuit of dangerous and illegal nuclear and missile programs. Most recently, Beijing advanced national security legislation that violates its commitment to the Hong Kong people to enjoy a high degree of autonomy, calling the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration a statement of policies rather than the treaty that it is. In addition, the PLA's large-scale exercise to simulate the seizure of the Taiwan-controlled Pratas Island is a destabilizing activity that significantly increases the risk of miscalculation. This catalog of bad behavior accompanies a pattern of the CCP's brazen disregard for international commitments, from its failure to uphold its obligations under the World Trade Organization to regularly disrespecting the rights of other nations under the 1982 Law of the Sea Convention. Further, China's unlawful land reclamation and military exercises on and around disputed features in the South China Sea are patently inconsistent with its commitment set out in the 2002 Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. Make no mistake, the CCP has been engaged in this sort of behavior for many years, but today, its true intentions are on full display for all to see. We call on China's leaders to abide by the international laws and norms that China and the Chinese people have benefited greatly from over the years. And while we hope the CCP will change its ways, we must be prepared for the alternative. Together, we must uphold the free and open system that has secured peace and prosperity for millions and defend the principles that undergird it, namely respect for sovereignty and independence for all nations, regardless of their size, peaceful resolution of disputes, mutual adherence to international laws and norms, and the promotion of free, fair, and reciprocal trade. These are not American values. These are universal, and we must be united in their defense. To this end, the United States made an important announcement last week to clarify our policy on the South China Sea. It plainly states that our recognition of maritime claims is consistent with international law, favors the sovereign rights of Southeast Asian partners, and rejects the PRC's excessive and unlawful maritime claims that have been used to bully smaller countries from accessing offshore resources in their own exclusive economic zones. This policy champions a free and open Indo-Pacific in which all the region's diverse nations can live and prosper in peace, and makes clear that the PRC has no right to turn international waters into a zone of exclusion or its own maritime empire. Our actions back up our policies. In 2019, we conducted the greatest number of freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs, in the South China Sea in the 40-year history of the FONOPS program, and we will keep up the pace this year. Additionally, on 2 occasions earlier this month, 2 carrier strike groups conducted exercises together in the South China Sea for the first time since 2012, a clear and powerful signal that we will fly, sell, and operate wherever international law allows. Let me be clear. China is a country with a storied history, a rich culture, and a wonderful people. We are not in search of conflict. We are committed to a constructive and results-oriented relationship with China and, within our defense relationship, to open lines of communication and risk reduction. I've personally spoken to my PRC counterpart on multiple occasions, and before the year is out, I hope to visit the PRC for the first time as Secretary in order to enhance cooperation on areas of common interest, establish the systems necessary for crisis communications, and reinforce our intentions to openly compete in the international system in which we all belong. In closing, we firmly believe no single nation can or should dominate the public commons, and we will continue to work alongside our allies and partners to support a prosperous and secure Indo-Pacific for all. We will demonstrate the virtues and resilience of a global system built upon transparency, openness, and other shared values. We will enhance our readiness and ask our partners to do the same. We will strengthen and expand our unmatched alliance network. And together, we will ensure peace, prosperity, and security for generations to come. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much indeed. A number of blue hands have been raised, and I would ask anyone who seeks the floor to grab my attention now. I see 7 or 8 already, and not to worry, I'll try to involve as many as possible. What I'd like to do, Mr. Secretary, is to take 3 questions first, and I will tell the 3 people who they are and then allow them to talk in that sequence. I would ask them each to keep their question to under a minute if possible. The first 3 people I will ask will be Indrana Bakshi from the Times of India, then Chung-Min Lee from Korea, and then Nayanima Basu from Printline Media, also in India. So Indrina Bakshi, you have the floor.
Thank you, John. Secretary, thank you for your comments. I wanted to ask you, since you spoke about India, I wanted to ask you what your views are of the current standoff between Indian and Chinese troops in Ladakh, and what kind of cooperation do you envisage with India in view of the crisis that is currently unfolding? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Indrana. And now to Chung-Min Lee from Korea. Chung-Min, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My question to you is over a flurry of media reports recently on the possible withdrawal of U.S. forces from Korea, unless the South Korean pays much more for host nation support. Is there any truth to these media reports? Is the Pentagon, under President Trump's orders, considering any reduction or withdrawal of U.S. forces? Because such a move, in my view, would be very detrimental to our alliance, to co-defense and deterrence, and only help our adversaries. Thank you very much.
And finally, in this round, Nayanima Basu. Go ahead, Nayamina. Go ahead, Nayamina. I'll move on then to one more for the moment. If I could, to Rory Metcalf from Australia.
Oh, hello. It's Rory Metcalf from the National Security College at the Australian National University. Secretary, your speech, I guess, is inspiring at one level, but the big question remains: how well resourced do you think the United States is, particularly in the Indian Ocean, the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, to play to its strengths, to deter and to maintain stability?
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, over back to you.
Thank you, John, and thanks everybody for those questions. I'll address them in the order that they were asked. First, with regard to the situation between India and China, we are obviously monitoring it very closely and what's happening along the line of actual control. And we are very pleased to see that both sides are trying to de-escalate the situation, and we continue to
I think we've lost the Secretary's voice for the last 30 seconds or so.
I'm
There
sorry.
we are. You're back again.
There?
Yeah.
So I'll go back to where I was, just to say, look, I've issued no orders to withdraw forces from the Korean Peninsula. I will say, though, when I took office, I was clear that I was going to implement the National Defense Strategy. Part and parcel of that means looking at every geographic combatant command and making sure that we are optimized and positioned as well as possible to accomplish not just fulfilling the NDS, but also making sure the regional missions we've tasked are there. So we will continue to look at adjustments at every command we have in every theater to make sure we are optimizing our forces. We are moving toward additional concepts, new concepts such as dynamic force employment. And I continue to want to pursue more rotational force deployments into theaters because it gives us, the United States, greater strategic flexibility in terms of responding to challenges around the globe. And then on the last issue, with regard to resources in the Indian Ocean, again, part of these geographic combatant command reviews I'm looking at are means to do a few things, not just optimize our forces in a particular theater, but look to freeing up forces to either reposition back to the United States to conduct these dynamic force employments or to prepare for
I think we've lost the Secretary's voice again.
I think we lost you then again for a second, but I was just saying, I think the recent exercise ongoing between the Indian Navy and the USS Nimitz just shows the growing cooperation between our countries and our ability, the United States' ability to project power into the region and to sustain it, by the way, with our allies and partners.
Marvelous. Thank you very much. So I think I'll take 3 or 4 now. The next one will be Bethany Allen Abraham, who I think has started Axios. It's a good newsletter on China. You've got the floor, Bethany.
Great. Thank you so much. Secretary, I would like to ask about the South China Sea. You mentioned that the U.S. has now been doing more FONOPs than in the past. What else can the U.S. do to try to perhaps even walk back some of the territory that China has claimed? They now have significant deterrent capabilities in the South China Sea. Should there be an outbreak of regional conflict, it could make it more difficult for the U.S. to engage. Are there discussions about consequences placed on China for those activities, something more than just FONOPs?
And one of the interesting things about contemporary international politics is that there are growing links between the Middle East and East Asia, whose security, economic, and political connections are important. So the next person I'll ask to speak is Sheikh Mubarak al-Sabah from Kuwait.
Yes, my question is, do we think that we're going to see a new maritime security construct in the Indo-Pacific as it is in the Arabian Gulf?
Thank you very much, Mubarak. I'll take 2 more, and from Japan, Taketsugo Sato-san. Go ahead, Sato. You should be able to unmute yourself. If not, I'll go to Ashley Townsend.
Thanks, Dr. Chipman. Secretary, thanks very much for your remarks. 2 of the 3 pillars of your Indo-Pacific strategy concern partnerships and alliances through the focus on networking. I'm interested in your take, not on the short-term objectives of these pillars, but on the longer-term objectives. We down here in Sydney at the US Studies Centre have been working on American strategic capacity in the Indo-Pacific and arguing in favour of a Pacific Deterrence Initiative, in part because it will be required to multilateralize deterrence and multilateralize the maintenance of the balance of power in the region. Do you also foresee that as the end goal of the US's increasing focus on alliances and partnerships?
Thank you very much. And I'll ask one more from Catherine Hill, please, who's from the Financial Times. Catherine?
Thank you, John. Secretary, another question about the South China Sea. When recently we saw the dual carrier operations earlier this month, the first time in the South China Sea, some Chinese state media were remarking or stressing that any US carrier moving around there was there at the pleasure of the PLA, making reference to China's A2AD capabilities. Could you explain what the US considerations are with regard to China's increasing threat to US surface combatants? Thank you.
Maybe I'll take one more just to get a bit more geographical diversity in. Koa Pham, please. Koa Pham. There you go.
Yes, I want to ask about the the militarization of the South China Sea. What will the U.S. Specifically do to stop the fortification of the islands that China has undertaken? Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Over to you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you for those questions. We have 5 of them I've written down. Some of them are the same, so I'll try and capture as many as I can here. First of all, I think the question was, what are we doing in the South China Sea? What does it mean for the long-term goal? Much of what I said up front is our long-term vision. We want to deter against coercive behavior by the Chinese in the South China Sea. Now, we know it's been going on for years. China's bullying, their coercion, their compellence of others, particularly smaller countries. It seems that your arm gets twisted harder the smaller the country you are. So we want to continue to deter against coercive behavior. Second, we want to ensure freedom of navigation and overflight. 80% of the world's trade flows through the Indo-Pacific and particularly the South China Sea. So we want to make sure that we maintain a free and open Pacific, because otherwise, if that trade commerce gets cut off or gets impacted, it has a dramatic impact on people's prosperity, their livelihoods, and our ability for our economies to function. So it's very important we maintain freedom of navigation. And then third, we want to strengthen our partnerships in the South, in the region, so that Southeast Asia countries can maintain and defend their own waters. That's what we want to do, is make sure that China respects the sovereignty of others and follows the rule of law and international norms. Now, we're going to continue to do that through exercises. We're going to continue to speak about the importance of international law, as we did recently by redefining our views with regard to maritime disputes. Last year I attended the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, where we had good discussions both formally in the meeting and on the sidelines. It's clear from all the ASEAN countries that they are very concerned about China's bad behavior, and we've seen it pick up in the last 6 months since the COVID-19 hit. And China's behavior in the context of COVID-19 is a whole nother discussion about China's bad behavior, if you will. Other things we're doing is adapting our policies. We will continue to do exercises like RIMPAC and things like that. Related to that, somebody spoke about, carrier operations. I don't know what the Chinese meant by that hollow statement about American carriers being there by the pleasure of the PLA or something. Look, American aircraft carriers have been in the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific since World War II, and we will continue to be there. And we're not going to be stopped by anybody. We're going to sail, fly, and operate anywhere international law allows. And we do that, again, to assert international law and rights, to back up the sovereignty of our friends and partners, and to reassure them that we will be there to defend those things. with regard to somebody asked about a new maritime security construct in the Indo-Pacific, it's not something we've talked about. Again, we have what we do see is a pickup, though, in terms of freedom navigation operations being conducted bilaterally between us and other countries, or multilateral FONOPs we see happening. I mentioned RIMPAC. We see more countries joining RIMPAC. We talk about bilateral exercises happening. And I just generally see a much greater cooperation between countries, if you will. And this gets into, I think, the final question about multilateralization. You know, my experience has been now working on the Indo-Pacific since the 90s, if you will, that so much of it, unlike Europe, is very bilateral instead of multilateral. But I will tell you, in the last few months, I've seen a greater push toward multilateralization. We held, for example, in the past couple months, a virtual Five Eyes defense ministerial meeting between us, you know, the United States and 4 other countries. That was very successful, and I think we all agreed, the partners, the allies, to continue those on a more routine basis. We had several other multilateral discussions with for example, the United States, Japan, and Australia. So we see coronavirus actually pushing us to multilateralize, and I think that's a good thing that we all agree should continue. And I will tell you again, I've had multiple conversations with my counterparts over the last few months. As I mentioned earlier, just last night, I spoke to the Defense Minister of Korea, Defense Minister of New Zealand yesterday, and I've spoken to many of my counterparts, the Indians, the Japanese, Brunei, others. And so I actually see the Indo-Pacific coming together, and I think there'll be greater multilateralization. That would be my vision, is to bring us together more in terms of a network to operate more closely together, to consult diplomatically, and to pursue things in that manner, to defend, again, the international rules-based order, to defend the sovereignty of countries in the region, Pacific Island countries, ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, and all those different things that we've been talking about for some time now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll take another group of 4. I'll warn them in advance so they can prepare to unmute themselves as I allow them to talk. So it'll be in the following order. Lindsay Hilsum first, then Eric Lee, then Sophia McBride, then Maya Nowens. But Lindsay Hilsum first.
Lindsay Hilsum here from Channel 4 News. Secretary, following on from the questions you've been asked, there is a real fear, I think, in Taiwan now of, you know, the ultimate, a Chinese invasion. We understand everything that you're talking about in terms of deterrence. But, you know, if, you know, that is being thought about as a possibility in the next few years, what would America do under those circumstances? What de-escalation mechanisms are there? And what about the treaty that binds you?
Thank you very much. Next, Eric Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My question follows the previous quite nicely. My question is about Taiwan. The Indo-Pacific strategy states that the U.S. is pursuing a strong relationship with Taiwan and to faithfully implement the TRA. And we've seen that second part with upholding the commitment to the TRA with record numbers of arms sales and FONOPs. But my question is more about the Indo-Pacific strategy in specific. Like, how will the department incorporate Taiwan into this strategy, and what are the next steps to advancing the U.S.-Taiwan security relationship? And on the final end is, Mr. Secretary, what is your position on Taiwan's overall defense concept? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And next, Sophie McBride.
Hi there, it's Hugh Baldwin speaking in place of Sophia McBride. The UK's Russia report has been released. It found the UK doesn't know if Russia attempted to interfere in the Brexit referendum or other elections because spy agencies were never asked to investigate. The UK has been accused of taking its eye off the ball. Given the report's findings, what is your advice to the UK about, firstly, how seriously to take the threat of Russian interference, and secondly, how to tackle it? Should there be more UK-US cooperation to counter it? And what is the UK risking by having a blind spot to this threat?
Thanks very much. Well, Maya Nowens next, and I'm sure it's Maya Nowens and she's not operating under anyone else's nameplate. Maya, go ahead.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned that 5G is a game-changing technology, and you've also spoken extensively on the importance that the U.S. places on its partnerships in the Indo-Pacific and the interoperability between the U.S. and partner and allied militaries. How will the integration of Huawei and other broader Chinese digital technologies in Indo-Pacific countries change or affect the U.S.'s partnerships and interoperability with these countries? Thank you.
That's a really important question. I should put in what in the UK is called a party political broadcast, which is the IISS is doing a great deal of work on the so-called digital Silk Road. And Mayor Nowens, who works with us, has assembled with our team over 900 unique data points. And we would hope that to be publicly available shortly to ensure that there's an evidence-based analysis of the extent of the digital Silk Road activity. But I'll ask one more person before the Secretary answers what will now be 5 questions. That's one of our young leaders, Blake Hertzinger, please. Blake, go ahead.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. So there's been some public discussion in the past few years of a privately communicated red line being one of the things that stopped Chinese reclamation at Scarborough Shoal back around 2016. But I was wondering if you'd be willing to discuss where our red lines are today in 2020.
Over to you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you very much. I'll kind of in no particular order, but I'll just take the last one first. It's not good practice to discuss red lines, whatever those case may be. I will just tell you up front is we feel very strongly about the things I've mentioned before, about our shared values, about defending the international rules and norms, about living up to our commitments in the Indo-Pacific, whether they are treaty-bound commitments or whether they are political commitments that we made to others. So that's what's the important thing, and we'll continue to push. I guess that lends nicely to discussing Taiwan, which was one of the first questions. Look, the PLA activities in the region are destabilizing, and they significantly increase the risk of miscalculation. It goes without saying, too, I don't think anybody can be assured, particularly Taiwan, about Chinese commitments because we've seen them violate them over and over and over again. I was in Hong Kong for the handover in '97. I remember very clearly China was going to commit to sustaining the basic law, and they promised one country, 2 systems. I don't think anybody in Taiwan believes that at this point that China has any intention whatsoever of living up to its one country, 2 systems. So that's a problem. Look, our problem with our Taiwan policy has been consistent since 1979 under the Taiwan Relations Act about what we would do. And then in 1982, President Reagan established the policy of conditioning arms agreements, arms sales to Taiwan based entirely on the threat posed by the PRC. So we've seen the PRC become more aggressive. We've seen them build up their military. We've seen them be more assertive. They got hundreds, if not over 1,000 missiles aimed at Taiwan. And we've seen President Xi and his party really take this to a new level. So we remain committed to regional peace and security. We will live up to our commitments to Taiwan, which is all in the interest of a secure and stable region, if you will. With regard to Taiwan, we talked about arms sales. We will continue to conduct arms sales. We will continue to conduct freedom of navigation operations, and that includes in the Taiwan Strait. And I think we did our most recent one in the past week or so. But again, I think it's China is really the ones aggravating the situation vis-a-vis Taiwan, and then more broadly in the region, as we've discussed a few times. The question about Russia and UK, I actually didn't hear all of it. I think it may have been about election security. I would just say, look, it's very clear that Russia and other countries, we believe, want to influence American elections, if not interfere. And we work very hard at doing that. The United States Department of Defense is in support of an interagency effort led by the Department of Homeland Security. And we are fully confident we can preserve the integrity of our elections because that is the most important thing to a democracy, is to ensure the integrity of your elections. We had a very good 2018 election, and I'm confident that we are doing everything we can to ensure the same for the upcoming presidential, congressional, and Senate elections. So with regard to our UK friends, very, very capable country. We're obviously always ready to provide assistance, but I wouldn't put past Russia to try and influence any election out there. We've seen them do it in other parts of the world. And then lastly, with regard to 5G, look, 5G is a game changer, not just for security relationships, but also for the prosperity and for tech dominance, if you will. That is why we believe Huawei is supported, influenced, resourced by the government in China, and why we have great concerns about Huawei. I've spoken about this numerous times in NATO defense ministerials, our concern about the Chinese influence in the alliance, and about Huawei's influence in particular with regard to our systems. It's clear to us, we've been very clear-eyed about it, that if Huawei or other Chinese companies were to get into our networks, that we would doubt the security of those networks, and that would severely impact our ability to share intelligence with our allies and our ability to conduct operational planning and do all those things. So allowing Huawei in would be an impediment. That applies to NATO as well as our other treaty partners around the world, particularly our partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific. And so we've been encouraging for some time now countries to forego Huawei. And I'm pleased to see the tide turning on that. We've seen the UK walk away in the past few weeks from Huawei. We see other countries in Europe doing the same, and we see countries in the Indo-Pacific have already made that decision. So we will continue to move forward here in the United States, but I'm pleased with regard to where the trend is heading right now.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. We'll take another group of 4, possibly 5. I'll give warning to the first 4 so they can be ready to unmute themselves when I call them. Dian Sapchari, Aaron Connolly, Yoso Fumamoto, and Robert Ward. But Dian Sapchari first, who's from the Jakarta Post in Indonesia. Dian?
Good evening, Minister. I want to ask a question about Indonesia cooperation with Indonesia, because earlier this month, Defense Security Cooperation Agency announced the possibility of sale of 8 Osprey aircraft, but Indonesian officials have been keeping distance from this deal. We also noted that Minister Prabowo has traveled to Russia to meet Russian and Chinese counterparts, but could you give us like the strategic significance of this purchase for Indonesia and the US? Thank you.
Thank you, Dian. And I'll move on to Aaron Connolly, please, from the IISS office in Asia, who also follows Indonesia closely. Aaron.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Mr. Secretary, you spoke 4 times about shared values. I was wondering if I could press you a little bit to go into a little bit of detail about what those values are. Because when you look at the United States treaty allies in the Indo-Pacific, and in particular in Southeast Asia, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha in Thailand took power in a military coup in 2014. President Duterte stands accused of limiting the space for debate in the Philippines. And some of the United States Democratic allies in recent years have raised questions about the United States values under the Trump administration. I was wondering how you would address those questions, and also a little bit more detail on the values that you believe are shared with the Indo-Pacific. Thanks very much.
And Robert Ward, who's the Japan chair at the IISS. Robert.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your broad-ranging comments on the region. Japan's defense policy debate has evolved very rapidly in recent years. How do you see Japan's security role developing in the Indo-Pacific? Thank you.
And also from Japan, the Mainichi correspondent in DC, Yoso Fumamoto. Yoso.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to ask about the possible deployment of intermediate range missiles to Asia. Mr. Secretary, do you have a timetable of the deployment of these missiles? If not, could you give us some idea where are the candidate sites? Thank you.
And since you've all been so crisp, I think I'll squeeze in 2 more. Lynn Kwok, please.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, I'd like to ask you a question specifically on Mischief Reef in the South China Sea. Now, in Secretary Pompeo's recent statement, he said that the United States shares the tribunal's finding that the PRC has no lawful territorial or maritime claim to Mischief Reef, which falls under the Philippines' sovereign rights and jurisdiction. Now, of course, Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation that the Chinese have transformed into an artificial island and have militarized. What does Secretary Pompeo's recent statement mean for DoD in terms of operations in or around Mischief Reef? Because of course, neither foreign ops nor military exercises in the South China Sea help to reverse or stop the increase of fortification of Mischief Reef.
Thanks very much. And finally, in this round, Antoine Levesque.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. How much do you worry about nuclear and crisis stability between India and Pakistan, be it in the subcontinent or growingly in the Indian Ocean? There are ample tensions and rhetoric, as well as a general lack of official dialogue between the two countries. So what does the United States believe is its continuing role in that regard?
Over to you, Mr. Secretary.
So many questions, so little time. Okay, so I'll try and capture them all as best I can. The first question on cooperation of India, with Indonesia. You know, we have a very good relationship with Indonesia. I've spoken to my counterpart several times this year alone, and I think it's, you know, he has a background of actually being in America, if you will, as part of his military service. So we have a very good relationship, and as we've talked, he understands that we fully support Indonesia's sovereignty, that we support them as partners who are trying to push back against China's malign behavior in the region, particularly as they contest Indonesia's exclusive economic zone there. We do encourage, as we do all allies and partners, the purchase of American equipment. Why? Because first and foremost, it brings us together. Secondly, it improves our interoperability in case something does happen. And third, we just think they are better alternatives to anything else out there. So for those reasons, we continue to talk about arms sales between our countries. My view is we should continue to meet and have discussions. Again, I've done that several times with the defense minister, and I hope to visit Indonesia during my tenure as well. So I think all those things are very important. The question about shared values, look, the shared values, we could list through them. I'll give you things that come immediately to mind. It's things like democracy, right? Open markets, human rights, respect for human rights, respect for individual rights and liberties, freedom of the press, freedom of association, all those things that we take that we know, at least for us, are embodied in the United States Constitution, something that I and others have sworn an oath to support and defend. And you know, with regard to the ebbs and flows of other countries, I try and stay out of politics here in the United States, and I'm certainly not going to get into the politics abroad. But those are our shared values, a short list, and those are the things that we've sought to advance and support and defend for many, many years. And we believe that it has served all of us well for decades, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Speaking of the Indo-Pacific, we talked about the Japan's security role, if you will. I see Japan's security role as growing. They are clearly an anchor of security in the Pacific. We have a great relationship with the Japanese. Many American forces are there in Japan, and we obviously welcome a more active role for Japan in the region. It's a trusted friend with excellent capacity and growing capabilities. And again, we just see the relationship growing there. And I speak often to my Japanese counterpart on what they can do and how we can better work together as treaty allies. With regard to Mischief Reef, in accordance with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and the 2016 arbitral ruling, we believe that PRC's claims are unlawful. And so we will not recognize an EEZ around the artificial island or territorial waters. And again, we will continue to work closely with our partners and allies and conduct the fawn ops that we intend to do to be clear to China that we don't respect their claims. I think the last issue was nuclear crisis stability between Pakistan and India. Obviously, when you got two countries with nuclear capabilities and tension between them, it's something we watch very closely. I also talk to my Indian and Pakistani counterparts fairly routinely, and this is just something that you got to keep a close watch on, because nobody wants to see a conflict between two countries, and certainly not one that could escalate. I don't see any indications right now that's happening at all, but it is something that we watch, not just in that part of the world, but in other parts of the world, obviously.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much. I think we'll stop in 4 minutes, but that gives me time to ask for 2 more questions, you to reply, and then for me to thank you for the 59 minutes you've so generously given to us. So the 2 people I'll ask will be Alan Bowden from the UK and then Shadeen Pish from Cambodia. So Alan Bowden, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from London. 2-part question from me, but hopefully quite concise. We've spoken extensively about the Indo-Pacific, but I'm very interested as well in how you view the balance for the US between the Indo-Pacific and the Euro-Atlantic, and more perhaps core NATO region of operations, and your sort of plans and overall balance for presence and priorities between those 2 regions. And then related to that, how you view the role of partnerships with countries in that more NATO or Euro-Atlantic region, and how the role of those partnerships in the Indo-Asia-Pacific. You mentioned the Five Eyes, but if you'd like to say more about that, I'd be very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we'll conclude with the Executive Director of the Cambodian Institute for Strategic Affairs, Shadeen Pish.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretaries. I'm glad to have the last question as well. My questions is with regards to this year, US and Cambodia celebrating the 70 years anniversary of our diplomatic relations, but in the last few years, the relation has not been on a good term. In the Indo-Pacific strategy, there is a specific paragraph outlining, addressing specifically to Cambodia and China relation, or Cambodia increasing close relation to China. And there was a big accusation in DC for the last few months that there might be, there is a speculation that China is building a naval base in the Cambodia territory. From your perspective, Mr. Secretary, what do you think can help to strengthen Cambodia-US relation, putting aside the geopolitics and the accusation as such? Thank you so much.
Mr. Secretary.
Well, thanks for those questions. I think on the, I'll go to the last one first, if you will, on U.S. Cambodia. I think let's speak to the broader issue, and that is concern about countries, if you will, are moving closer into China's orbit. And we see that happening for different reasons. A major reason why countries do is because China is coercing them. They are threatening economic sanction or diplomatic isolation or doing other things. We also see China enticing countries with loans that end up being debt traps, or with the promise of building out naval bases that might benefit them commercially. But all these is a Chinese effort to expand its power and to expand its influence in the region, and then of course beyond the region as well. You know, China's first base overseas is actually in Djibouti, of all places. So we get very concerned where we see countries succumbing to this type of coercion. That's why I've said our ambition in the Indo-Pacific is to defend our friends and allies and partners, to defend the sovereignty of countries, to defend the international rules-based order and all those things, and then call upon China to live up to its commitments. So again, I think the more that countries can embrace these same concepts and can help stand up to the Chinese and stand for values that I discussed on this call, I think the better, because if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves in a situation where China is calling the shots, and we have a completely different international order, or at least regional order, that puts China at the top and really is based on Chinese values. And I don't think those are things that any of us want to see happen in the long run. With regard to the first question, Indo-Pacific versus Europe, I don't see it as a competition per se. Our national defense strategy says we are now in an era of great power competition. That means that we have to prepare for high intensity conflict going forward. And we've kind of tiered countries, and the top tier is China, then Russia. And so that's why I've put particular emphasis on those two regions, and in particular the two commands responsible for them, Indo-PACOM and European Command, respectively. That doesn't mean it's not a global competition, because it is. We see both China and Russia in far-flung places, whether it's the Arctic, where Russia clearly has a boundary, but China doesn't. We see them in Africa. We see them in the Middle East. So my goal is to balance those two areas and to make sure that I prioritize them appropriately, but also in the context of the other commands that we have out there, which is why I'm taking a very close look at how we resource, our disposition of forces, all those things that we do around the globe to make sure that we're optimizing to prepare for this long-term competition, this great power competition, if you will, with China, then Russia.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for having inspired such an excellent conversation with such a very diverse participation on the Indo-Pacific. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, also for supporting IISS efforts at defense diplomacy and promoting both reasoned debate and strategic transparency, in which you've engaged so wonderfully today. And finally, let me hope that we will be able to see you personally between the 4th and the 6th December at the IISS Manama Dialogue in the Kingdom of Bahrain, where we'll be gathering defense and foreign policy and national security establishments from almost all the regions that have been engaged in this call. Mr. Secretary, from all of us at the IISS and all who were on this call, thank you very much for your engagement.
Good. Thank you, John. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to your audience today. Thank you for hosting this. Very well done. A good discussion, a wide-ranging discussion. And I do hope to follow up with you sometime soon. If not Manama, then Shangri-La next year. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.